62 million Americans are under a severe storm risk on this 4th of July. More than 1,000 miles separate today's two most dangerous storm zones. Nearly 20 million more Americans will face this same threat again tomorrow, which means Independence Day itself is arriving with a genuinely complicated forecast attached. Folks, this is the day we have been building toward, and it is finally here. Let's break this down region by region, then look ahead to tomorrow as well. First, let's start in the east, where the Mid-Atlantic faces the more immediate threat, which means an enhanced risk of severe storms covers a stretch of the Mid-Atlantic today. Washington, D.C. and the surrounding region sit right in the middle of that same zone. Early afternoon is when storms are expected to fire first, over the Blue Ridge and Shenandoah Valley. So from there, storms are forecast to push northeast through northern Virginia into D.C., which means the nation's capital could see storms arrive right during afternoon celebrations today, which means central Maryland, Delaware, and southern New Jersey are included in that path, which means Baltimore and Arlington are also included inside that enhanced risk boundary. Columbia, Maryland sits right in the middle of that same dangerous stretch this afternoon. Triple-digit heat is possible, with afternoon temperatures reaching the upper 90s to near 100, which means that intense heat is helping fuel strong, sudden downdrafts inside these storms. Widespread damaging wind gusts, forecasters say, will be the primary threat this afternoon. 70 to 75 miles per hour. That is the range for an isolated, stronger gust, which means a gust that strong can snap tree limbs and send debris flying fast. That same 62 million person risk includes everyone inside this mid-Atlantic zone too. Beach towns along the Jersey Shore and Delaware coast should watch this system closely tonight, which means evening boardwalk fireworks could face delays right as crowds are gathering. Sandra, a retired librarian in Alexandria, Virginia, sits directly inside today's enhanced risk zone. Sandra says a holiday storm threat this close to home changes her whole afternoon plan, which means she already moved her family's cookout from the backyard to the garage. She says a covered space beats a beautiful yard the moment thunder starts rolling in, which means her neighbors down the street made the exact same call this morning. A similar setup, forecasters say, is expected farther north, from the Allegheny Plateau into southern New England. So folks from Pennsylvania into New England should still keep away to get warnings, which means damaging gusts remain the main concern there too, with slightly less coverage. That threat there arrives a bit later in the afternoon than the D.C. area storms, one of two enhanced risk zones. That is the mid-Atlantic side of today's forecast. Now here is the second enhanced risk zone, and the plains face a very different threat. Over 1,000 miles from D.C., that zone covers southern Kansas into northern Oklahoma, which means two completely different parts of the country share today's most serious risk, which means a weakening storm cluster near Wichita leaves behind an outflow boundary today. That leftover boundary becomes the focus for fresh storm development later this afternoon, which means Tulsa and Oklahoma City both sit close enough to feel effects from this system, which means residents there should also keep half an eye on tonight's radar too. Strong heating and steep lapse rates, forecasters say, will destabilize the atmosphere by afternoon, which means the atmosphere there is being primed for seriously dangerous storms by evening, which means a few supercells are possible early in the cycle, especially near that boundary. Very large hail is on the table, forecasters warn, with those early storms today. Which means Sandra says even Alexandria neighbors are watching this plains threat from afar, which means strong downbursts are also possible, capable of damaging entire lines of trees. A tornado or two, forecasters caution, cannot be ruled out along that boundary tonight. That risk increases the longer storms sit along the same boundary without moving much, which means residents near Wichita should treat tonight's warnings as real, serious business. Which means Hutchinson and towns nearby share that exact same elevated tonight threat. That same 62 million person risk, remember, is part of what the plains face today. Earl, a rancher out in western South Dakota, is watching that same plains setup today. Earl says a boundary that sits still for hours is exactly what worries him most, which means storms can train over the same spot instead of moving on quickly. He says the 4th of July never stops the sky from doing whatever it wants, which means ranchers out there watch the horizon just as closely on holidays as any other day. No two ways about it. Scattered storms are expected across the central high plains today, which means places like Scotts Bluff and Sidney, Nebraska sit inside that convective line, which means that activity could organize into a line pushing into northeastern Colorado tonight, which means a dry line from the Oklahoma Panhandle into the Texas Panhandle adds more risk, which means a few storms there could still produce strong, sudden downdraft wind gusts. No joke. Weak wind shear should limit how organized those storms become through the evening, which means far western Nebraska shares tonight's risk right alongside the Kansas-Oklahoma corridor. The second enhanced risk zone, that is the plains side of today's full forecast, which means the lower Missouri Valley into the Ohio Valley faces its own round of storms, which means St. Louis and Indianapolis both sit inside that same developing storm corridor, which means a wind threat stretching from Missouri into Indiana adds even more people at risk, which means places like Springfield, Illinois sit right inside that same developing corridor. Two separate disturbances, one from Kansas and one from overnight storms in Iowa, are involved here, which means those two systems are expected to interact over that same corridor today. Honest to goodness, wind shear stays fairly modest there, limiting how organized these storms become, which means an outflow-dominant storm mode with damaging gusts remains the top concern. So multiple storm clusters could merge together, strengthening the wind threat by evening, which means Columbus. Ohio could also see storms move through tonight as this tracks east, which means residents from Missouri through Ohio should all keep warnings within reach tonight. Frank, a retired teacher down in Springfield, Illinois, is right inside that same corridor today. Frank says a holiday cookout always gets an asterisk when storms are already in the forecast, which means he keeps his charcoal grill covered and ready to move under the porch. He says 30 years of 4th of July cookouts have taught him to always have a plan B, which means Frank moves the whole spread indoors the second thunder rolls in nearby. That same corridor carries its own slice of today's 62 million person risk. Dale, a retired electrician up in Toledo, Ohio, is watching that same corridor extend his way. Dale says an outflow-dominant storm mode still knocks down plenty of trees and power lines, which means he already checked his flashlights are charged ahead of tonight's fireworks show. He says losing power right during fireworks is a memory nobody wants from a holiday, which means Dale checks his neighbors on the block too, not just his own house. Which means today's slight risk zone stretches from New York through Denver and Oklahoma City. 62 million people. That is the population covered by today's slight risk zone alone, which means a broader marginal risk zone adds nearly 60 million more people to the mix. Millions of Americans have travel plans today, and storms could easily disrupt some of them, which means checking your flight status matters just as much as checking the forecast today. So here's a question for you. Which of today's two enhanced risk zones worries you more? Is it the Mid-Atlantic threat near D.C. or the Plains threat near Wichita tonight? Also, type the name of your city in the comments so we can track it for you. Now here's your forecast for tomorrow, because Sunday brings its own version of this pattern, which means a slight risk of severe storms is already posted for the Mid-Atlantic Sunday. That same general region gets another round of storms after today's system moves out. A surface low is expected to develop just east of the Blue Ridge by late Sunday afternoon. Sandra says a Sunday repeat is honestly not what anyone hoped for after today, which means that low becomes the focus for fresh thunderstorm development heading into evening. So storms are expected to form over higher terrain before spreading toward the coast, which means one or two clusters could organize with a real risk of damaging wind gusts, which means Pittsburgh and Toms River, New Jersey both sit inside that same Sunday zone, which means the Mid-Atlantic threat essentially repeats itself less than 24 hours later. Richmond. Virginia sits inside both today's stretch and tomorrow's back-to-back nights, which means out in the southern Rockies, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains could spark storms too. That activity could organize into a cluster moving into the high plains that evening, which means out toward the southern plains, Amarillo and Lubbock could see stronger gusts. Which means West Texas shares a piece of Sunday's severe weather picture as well. Strong wind gusts remain the top concern with any storms that form along that path, which means a separate low probability zone is being watched across northwestern North Dakota. That's forecasters keeping an eye on it, even though confidence remains fairly low there. Nearly 20 million people. That is what Sunday's slight risk zone covers across the mid-Atlantic, which means a broader marginal risk zone adds another 13 million people to that stretch. Sandra says her own Alexandria neighborhood sits inside both today's zone and tomorrow's. Margaret, a retired nurse down in Lake Charles, Louisiana, has worked plenty of holiday shifts. Margaret says the 4th of July always brings a predictable spike in storm-related injuries, which means simple precautions, like checking radar before fireworks, actually prevent real harm, which means she tells her own family to treat any thunder tonight like a hard stop. So here's how today and tomorrow fit together across this entire stretch of country. Over 1,000 miles apart. That is how far today's two enhanced risk zones sit. 62 million people. That is who shares some version of today's severe storm risk. And nearly 20 million more carry that same risk again tomorrow across a second stretch, which means back-to-back holiday weekend days are both dealing with real storm threats. Nobody is ready for how two distant parts of the country can share one bad forecast. Out of nowhere, a quiet holiday afternoon can turn into a warning within minutes. It's different when you realize your fireworks plan might come down to tonight's radar, which means if a severe warning hits your phone today, treat it like the real thing. Get to the lowest, most interior room in your home away from windows right away. That's an interior bathroom, closet, or hallway, not a porch, a garage, or a car, which means picking that safe spot now, before any warning arrives, saves precious time. Frank says holiday injuries like Margaret describes are exactly why he keeps his plan B ready, flat out. No fireworks show is worth standing outside once real lightning starts flashing nearby. Turn around, don't drown. Also applies tonight if you see standing water across any roadway, which means if you are near that mid-Atlantic heat, drink fluids and take breaks in shade. Outdoor celebrations should build in real breaks, not just push straight through the afternoon, which means shade, water, and a few extra minutes indoors go a long way today, which means never leaving kids or pets inside a parked car, even for a few minutes. Comment the name of your town below, and we will work it into tomorrow's update. So we will keep tracking both of today's zones straight through the overnight hours, which means updates will follow the moment either system shifts direction or intensity. Your comments genuinely help us decide which zone gets the closest coverage tomorrow, which means this two-zone holiday setup doesn't line up on the calendar all that often. Joining forces. A mid-Atlantic threat and a plains threat rarely share the same holiday evening. Keep your phone charged tonight, since losing power is the one thing that cuts off your warnings. Which means checking the forecast more than once today is honestly your smartest move. Sandra up in Alexandria already moved her cookout indoors. And Earl in South Dakota is watching the sky. Frank down in Springfield has his grill covered. And Dale in Toledo has his flashlights ready. Margaret down in Lake Charles is telling her family thunder means a hard stop tonight. No joke, happy 4th of July. And honestly, stay weather aware while you celebrate. Over 1,000 miles apart, two enhanced risk zones sharing the very same holiday. Mark my words, this pattern is not done even after tonight's fireworks wrap up. Plain and simple. Today calls for a charged phone, a backup plan, and zero guessing. 62 million Americans are under a severe storm risk on this 4th of July. More than 1,000 miles separate today's two most dangerous storm zones. Nearly 20 million more Americans will face this same threat again tomorrow.